Snow was slowly falling on the streets of New Orleans, painting the landscape with an unusual white blanket. The biting cold made people hunker down in their heavy coats and hurry to get somewhere warm. But for some, there was no specific destination, just the harsh reality of another night out in the open. John Carter pulled the threadbare blanket he had found a few days before closer to him. His stiff fingers trembled as he tried to light a small lighter, seeking some warmth for his hands. Life hadn't always been like this. He remembered the time when he had a job, a house, and a future. Now he was just another of the city's forgotten. If John's journey moves you, subscribe to our YouTube channel now. Just click subscribe, and you won't miss any of this story that will shock you. He sat down next to a brick wall near an alleyway, trying to shield himself from the wind that seemed to cut through his skin like invisible blades. Next to him, a thin, dirty dog in a brown coat curled up, seeking shelter and warmth. John called him Buddy. The dog, like him, had been rejected by the world, and now they were inseparable companions in the struggle to survive. The streets were busy, even in the cold. Cars drove by, their headlights illuminating the dirty snow, while groups of friends emerged from bars and restaurants, laughing and warming themselves with scarves and thick gloves. To John, this seemed like a distant reality. He watched the people's fleeting joy, but felt no envy, just a deep weariness, a desire to disappear into that endless whiteness. In the distance, he saw a group of people gathered outside a diner. The television inside was showing an urgent broadcast. Curious, he approached to listen to what was being said. The words of a well-dressed anchor cut through the icy air. President Donald Trump signed a new executive order today that directly affects welfare and housing programs for the homeless. John felt his chest tighten. He didn't need to hear any more. Hope, already a faint flame, flickered even more. He turned away from the diner and walked aimlessly. His feet ached in his old, worn-out shoes. Every step felt like a Herculean effort. But he followed him, his tail wagging slightly as if trying to comfort his owner. John stopped under a bridge where a few other homeless people were huddled around a small fire made of pieces of wood and cardboard. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of dirty clothes and hopelessness. "Have you heard the news?" a man with a thick gray beard asked. His name was Mike, and he had lived on these streets for over a decade. John nodded and sat down beside him. A woman named Teresa, with a tired look and a threadbare scarf covering her hair, sighed deeply. "They always take from those who have nothing," she murmured. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the flames. John knew Teresa was right. Every decision made at the top of the social pyramid seemed to push them further down. But what could they do? They were invisible to society. As he tried to warm his hands by the fire, John felt a sense of helplessness he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked over at Buddy, now curled up asleep beside him, breathing heavily. The dog understood no politics, no executive orders, no broken systems. All he knew was that he was there with his human friend, facing cold and hunger. He tilted his head back and looked up at the cloudy sky. The snow continued to fall softly, as if it wanted to erase everything and start over. But he knew that when morning came, nothing would have changed. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the worst of it. Subscribe to our YouTube channel now. Just click on subscribe so you don't miss a new video. The night was long and relentless. The cold cut like invisible blades, and even with his thin blanket, John felt his bones ache. Buddy shivered beside him, his little body curled up against him, searching for any remnant of warmth. Sleep came and went, punctuated by shivers and the constant fear that someone might try to steal what little they had. When the gray light of dawn finally began to paint the horizon, John forced himself to stand. His body protested with pain and stiffness, but he knew he couldn't stay there. This was life on the streets. Each new day was a struggle to find food, shelter, and, if he was lucky, a little dignity. He walked the streets, his worn shoes sinking into the dirty, trampled snow. The shiny shop windows reflected his image, a thin, unshaven man, his face marked by time and suffering. It was hard to recognize the man he had once been. He stopped in front of a cafe, where well-dressed customers were drinking hot coffee and reading newspapers. The smell of coffee and freshly baked bread made his stomach growl. He looked at Buddy and sighed. They needed food. They needed something to keep them going. He crossed the street to a small grocery store. He knew the owner, a man named Samir, who sometimes gave him stale bread and cold coffee. "Good morning, John," Samir said as he saw him come in. "It's cold outside. Would you like some coffee?" John nodded gratefully. Samir took a styrofoam cup and filled it with black coffee. The hot liquid burned his throat, but it was a relief. He thanked him and took a piece of dry bread that Samir offered him. Buddy ate his share greedily. As he ate, an old radio behind the counter broadcast news. The new executive order signed yesterday by President Trump is already causing protests among humanitarian organizations. The cut in funding could affect thousands of homeless people across the country. John felt a knot in his stomach. The world seemed to be conspiring to make them more and more forgotten. But something inside him began to boil, a feeling he had long since buried: outrage. He walked out of the market, took a deep breath, and looked at Buddy. "I think it's time we did something," he muttered, memories of a distant past. As he walked, his mind went back in time, before everything fell apart. He was an ordinary man living a modest life. He worked in construction, taking pride in each project. There was a time when he would come home to find the smell of dinner prepared by his wife, Emily, and the laughter of his daughter, Lily, filling the small apartment. He remembered the night it all started to fall apart. The company where he worked was undergoing drastic cutbacks. He and dozens of other workers were laid off without warning. At first, he tried to keep up appearances for Emily and Lily, but the bills piled up quickly. "We just need a little bit of luck," he had told Emily one night as he held her hands. But luck never came. When they were evicted, Emily took Lily and went to live with her sister in another state. John, consumed by shame and failure, refused to go with her. He told himself that he would soon find another job and everything would return to normal. But as the months passed, he found himself sinking deeper into poverty. It got to the point where he had nothing left but the clothes on his back and a blanket he'd found in the trash. Now, as he walked through the snow-covered streets, he felt the same sense of helplessness as before. But this time, he wasn't going to accept his fate without a fight. Searching for answers, John made his way to the public library, one of the few places he could go without being turned away. It was warm and quiet. He found a free computer and began researching the executive order. Disturbing headlines appeared on the screen. Trump cuts funding for social programs. Homeless shelters could close in months. Experts warn of rising street population. He felt his chest tighten. How many people would be left with nowhere to sleep? How many would freeze to death before anyone realized how serious the situation was? Next to him, an elderly woman typed slowly on a worn keyboard. She looked as tired as he did. When their eyes met, she smiled faintly. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. "Trying to understand how this order will affect us," he replied. The woman sighed. "They always take from the weakest. But perhaps it is time to show that we are not invisible." The words echoed in John's mind. We are not invisible. He left the library feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose, a spark of hope. That evening, John returned to the shelter where Teresa and Mike were staying. He told them about what he had discovered and the idea that was beginning to take shape in his mind. "What if we talked to the press? What if we protested?" he asked. Mike laughed. "Do you think anyone would listen to us?" Teresa, however, looked pensive. "Maybe he's right," she said. "Maybe it's time to make some noise." John looked at Buddy, then at his street companions. For the first time in years, he felt like there was something worth fighting for. Subscribe to our YouTube channel now. Just click subscribe to make sure you don't miss a new video. As the flame of resistance grew, the days that followed brought new challenges and new hopes for John and his companions. The community of displaced people, strengthened by the peaceful movement, began to organize larger events, walks through the city, roundtable discussions with supportive citizens, and even meetings with representatives of non-governmental organizations. The intention was clear: to make their voices heard so loudly that no one could ignore their existence. One gray morning, after weeks of planning, John led a diverse group of people down the town's main avenue. Amid handmade signs, carefully written words, and unwavering determination, everyone marched together, turning invisibility into a palpable presence. Buddy, the faithful companion, walked alongside John, drawing looks of sympathy and curiosity from the crowd. Journalists who had previously listened only to community radio stations now covered the march. Cameras captured scenes of solidarity and human resilience. Women and men seeking dignity, uniting against a system that marginalized them. The live broadcast reached homes and screens across the city, touching hearts and inspiring empathy. Public pressure mounted. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice and rights for the homeless. Politicians and local leaders, now under the watchful eye of the press and their constituents, began to respond to the demands, promising to review budget cuts and work on policies that could adequately support the vulnerable population. In the midst of this wave of change, John discovered that his own story was being shared on various platforms, becoming a symbol of the struggle for visibility and dignity. Although he received praise and messages of support, he remained focused on the people around him: Teresa, Mike, the group at the shelter, and thousands of others who found in their unity the strength they needed to continue the fight. The journey was not without setbacks, however. On a few occasions, groups opposed to the protest tried to intimidate the marchers. At such times, the calm and steadfastness of John and his comrades became even more important. They showed that their struggle was peaceful and legitimate, and earned the respect of even the most resistant. As negotiations with the authorities progressed slowly, real changes began to take place. New funds were allocated for temporary housing programs, and public spaces were transformed into shelters for the homeless during the colder months. The practice of enforced invisibility gave way to a society that began to look at the other, recognizing the humanity in every face marked by struggle. In the weeks following the massive demonstration, the city witnessed a movement that went beyond the streets. It was the seed of a cultural shift. More people got involved in volunteer work, the local community began to adopt more inclusive policies, and the community's renewed hope spread like a beacon of resistance against indifference. Sitting next to Buddy on a cold afternoon, John reflected on the journey he had made. From an invisible man in the shadows of the city, he had become the voice that broke the silence and inspired others to stand up and shout for their rights. The snow continued to fall, but now it seemed less cold, as if it held the promise of a new dawn, one in which no one would be left behind. The change wrought by the mobilization of John and his comrades reverberated throughout the city of New Orleans and beyond. Though the struggle for rights and recognition was not over, new complications and challenges would emerge. A new chapter was opening, one of possibility and renewed hope. In the months following the historic march, the city was visibly transformed. Pilot projects for temporary housing and employment initiatives emerged, supported by an unprecedented alliance between social organizations, volunteers, and some branches of government. John, Teresa, Mike, and other informal leaders, transformed by their collective experience, took on coordinating roles on various fronts, facilitating the connection between homeless people and the resources that society was beginning to make available. Despite the progress, much remained to be done. Bureaucracy, mutual suspicion, and the emotional scars of years of invisibility created obstacles. John continued his journey with Buddy at his side, visiting drop-in centers and talking to newcomers on the streets, sharing the message that they were not alone and that together they could forge a better path. The community also turned to education and awareness, sponsoring workshops so that people in vulnerable situations had access to classes, lectures, and, above all, listening to their own stories as a tool for empowerment. Teresa organized literary gatherings where those who had once been silenced found a voice in writing and storytelling that dialogued with the world. The media, which had previously ignored the suffering, took a more humane approach. Documentaries and in-depth reports showed not only the frightening statistics of the homeless, but also their dreams, efforts, and small daily victories. These stories helped break down the stigma and create a supportive network of solidarity among the general population. As the city warmed to the pace of social change, John found moments of introspection. Sitting on a bench in the square, he watched the transformation around him. The glow of new temporary homes, the smile of a young person finding opportunity, and the sense of belonging to a united community. Buddy, now calmer, lay at their feet, reinforcing the silent message of loyalty and affection that had never left him. The cold remained, but it felt different. It was no longer a merciless enemy, but a backdrop for human resilience. With every gesture of solidarity, every revised policy, and every shared story, there was the certainty that invisibility had come to an end and that the struggle for dignity that began in the shadows of the city was now illuminating a future full of new possibilities for all. If you were moved by John's journey, subscribe to our YouTube channel now. Just click subscribe so you don't miss any updates and can continue to be part of this community that turns challenges into hope. Over the months, the transformation that began as a cry for help has become deeply rooted in the community. The initiative of John and his colleagues not only changed policies and attitudes, but also began to shape a more humane and inclusive future for all involved. The city of New Orleans was undergoing a quiet renaissance. Housing projects evolved from simple temporary shelters to sustainable communities where homeless people, now active participants in social programs, found not only shelter, but also opportunities for work and education. Vocational training workshops and mentoring programs helped people like John reclaim their skills and dreams, while Buddy, always by their side, served as a symbol of perseverance and unwavering friendship. Once an invisible man in the shadows, John now held a prominent place in community councils, representing the voice of those who were rarely heard. He worked with government agencies and organizations to improve social policies, sharing his experiences and the wisdom he gained from the challenges he faced. His journey became a living testimony that adversity can be transformed into leadership and inspiration. Teresa, Mike, and other members of the original group persevered and expanded their network of support. Together, they created a multidisciplinary community center, a space where homeless people, volunteers, and professionals could come together to discuss innovative solutions and promote arts, culture, and education. The place became a gathering place for those seeking to reconnect and rebuild their lives, celebrating small daily victories and sharing moments of joy previously unimaginable. The media followed these stories with a sensitive eye, highlighting not only the difficulties overcome, but also the collective successes. Feature stories and documentaries showed how the combined efforts were transforming the city into an example of resilience and renewal. The stories of people who found new careers, resumed their studies, or simply regained their confidence inspired other communities across the country. As the changes were solidified, the scars of the past were also acknowledged. There were memories of freezing nights, hunger, and invisibility. But now these stories served as valuable reminders of where they had come from and how far they had come. Psychological support programs and therapy groups began to emerge to help individuals deal with their trauma and rebuild not only their lives, but also their sense of belonging and self-esteem. Toward the end of this journey, John walked down a street that had once seemed cold and hostile, but now shone with the light of community lamps and ongoing projects. He found Buddy, now older and calmer, resting in the shade of a tree that volunteers had planted in the center of the new neighborhood. Sitting next to his faithful friend, John reflected on the journey he had made. From initial pain to action, from invisibility to collective strength, from inertia to hope, the city and its people had learned that change begins when we recognize each other's humanity. And so, under a sky that promised new seasons, the story of John and his companions was no longer just about survival in the face of adversity, but about building a shared future where every voice, every effort, and every gesture of solidarity contributed to ensuring that no one was left behind.